This devotional is for Sunday, March the 12th, 2023, daylight savings time, by the way, so I hope that you remember to spring forward. But the title of our devotional today is Justice for All, Love Your Enemy, and a Call for Separation. Now, our scripture reading is only one chapter, and that is Exodus chapter 23. Now, the instructions that gave practical application of the Ten Commandments, which was in Exodus 20, now continues in Exodus 23. Now, as noted in prior devotions, Exodus 21 and 22, you're going to recognize in today's scripture the foundational principles of civil society. For instance, notice with me in verses 1 through 3 of Exodus 23 what I would describe as a demand for judicial integrity, justice for all. Now, the ninth commandment in Exodus 20 verse 16 read, "Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor." Now, for justice to be fair and impartial, God's law demanded that Israel's judges be above reproach and intolerant of any who would pervert justice. Really, chapter 23, verses 1 through 9, really deals with that sense of justice. Now, a witness, therefore, was commanded to state the truth. Today we would say, do you swear to tell the truth? They were not to bring a false accusation against an innocent man in a judicial matter, nor should a witness lie to spare the guilty their due punishment. Now, there was one law in verse 3 and one standard. Neither the poor nor the rich were granted a charitable judgment or spared the weight of the law. Now consider then, if you would, what I would describe as blind, compassionate justice, maybe in the terminology of the New Testament, love thy enemy. Now, Exodus 23 and verses 4 through 5 challenge man's natural bent for vengeance when wronged and commanded God's people to show kindness and grace even to an enemy. Now, understanding that Israel was chiefly an agricultural nation throughout its history, the illustration of returning an ox or an ass to its owner, even if he is an enemy, is practical and easily applied to our modern day. Essentially, it is this: that God's people are to offer aid and not sit by idly when they know that an enemy is struggling or has suffered loss. And then notice in verses 6 through 9 what I would define as justice for all. Exodus 23, 6 through 9 returns to then judicial matters and the demand for impartial judgment. Under God's law, the poor were not to be denied representation or justice. Judges were to see that the righteous judgment prevailed, verse 7. Now, again, verse 8, judges were not to be bribed, and non-Hebrews, strangers, foreigners in the land, were to be judged fairly. Now, notice, a little bit off topic now, what is the Sabbath year? That's Exodus 23 and verses 10 through 12. Now, emphasizing the significance of Sabbath rest, that was from Exodus 20 and verse 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Now we notice that Israel is also commanded to observe a Sabbath year. Now, every seventh year, the land was to remain fallow, that is, not to be plowed, and crops were not to be planted, according to verse 10. Now, the land was then to rest, and if seeds volunteered and grew to bear fruit, the poor and the beasts of the field were given liberty to eat. Now, both man and beast then, according to verse 12, the Sabbath was to be observed as a day to rest and be refreshed. And then you'll notice in Exodus 23 and verses 14 through 19 that there are three feasts, or we would say festivals, that were to be observed by Israel annually. Israel was commanded to observe, for instance, the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Passover, Exodus 23 15 and 18. And that, of course, commemorated the Passover in Egypt when the Lord spared the firstborn of Israel. Now, we have also in verse 16 the Feast of the Harvest, also known as the First Fruits, later celebrated as Pentecost. It was to be observed at the beginning of the harvest. That is, the Lord was to be given the first of the harvest. And then at that time, the first fruits of the harvest were to be offered. Finally, there was the Feast of the Ingathering, which was observed at the end of the harvest season, and it was a time of thanksgiving. Well, and then Exodus 23, verses 20 through 28, we have three promises whose fulfillment was conditioned upon the people hearing and obeying God's law and commandments. The first, if you'll notice in verse 20, God promised to send an angel before the nation. In verse 23, God promised to send an angel who would protect Israel, the nation, and cut off those nations that occupied the land of Canaan. Now, this angel was, verse 23, given to protect God's people, to provide, verse 25, and for their posterity, that is, verses 23 through 26, future generations. Now, unlike other nations that adopted a sacrifice to gods of the land they conquered, Israel was to destroy the idols of the Canaanite people. And then finally, verse 31, there's the third promise. And God promised to set the boundaries of the land he covenanted with Abraham. Now, he warned Israel that the people were not to befriend or make any covenant with the Canaanites they conquered or worship their gods. Furthermore, in verse 33, the Lord admonished that the heathen, and I'm going to quote, shall not dwell in thy land lest they, the heathen, make thee sin against me. For if thou serve their gods, it will surely be a snare unto thee. Well, a closing thought then on this matter of separation from the heathen. It is rarely preached in the pulpit, nor is it practiced in the pew. However, the principle of radical separation is found throughout the Scriptures. Israel was admonished, drive the heathen out of the land. And should they fail, the children of Israel, we find in verse 33, would invariably adopt the sins of their neighbors. Well, tragically, the same truth is all too evident in churches today. Paul, in his first letter to the believers in ancient Corinth, exhorted them, be not deceived. Evil communications corrupt good manners. 1 Corinthians 15:33. And then in his second letter to the same church, Paul admonished in 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 17, wherefore come out from among them, be ye separate. Now, Israel was called to separate from the heathen they conquered and to destroy their gods. And the same is true of believers today. We are to separate, distance ourselves from the ungodly, lest we become like them. In fact, we're commanded in Romans 12 and verse 2, be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good, acceptable, and perfect will of God. God would have his people in the churches today to be a holy people, even as he is holy. I invite you to go to my heartofashepherd.com website. There you will find 3 questions to consider for today's devotion, that personal study, a Bible study with someone, or maybe as a family study. God bless you. Thank you for being a part of Heart of a Shepherd, and bye-bye.